Jamie Donoghue is a DevOps ambassador, as you can see there. We're grateful to be able to have him with us today. He's the co-founder and principal consultant for VisionLed. And he spent over 20 years improving IT services for all kinds of organizations, public and private, in the UK and Australia, Southeast Asia. He, in fact, is joining us today, or for him this evening, from Singapore. So Jamie, we're grateful to have you here today. Thanks for staying up late for us. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Luke. And good morning or afternoon or good evening to everyone. So I'm going to cover 4 topics for you today. First is in the general theme of the presentation, which is about high velocity business. We'll also talk about market trends for ourselves as DevOps practitioners, and then how PeopleCert and its certification program can help you in your career and DevOps expertise. And finally, we'll talk about global knowledge and the certifications and courses that you can take in conjunction with PeopleCert together through global knowledge. So first slide there, why do we need high velocity business, and even what does high velocity business even mean? The gentleman that you can see in front of you is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, a gentleman called Klaus Schwab. And this quote is from back in 2015, so 5 years ago now. In the new world, it's not the big fish that eats the small fish, it's the fast fish that eats the slow fish. And what he's really referring to is a fundamental shift in business strategy. Prior to 2015 and even earlier, businesses thrived from economies of scale. So the nature of strategy was to become as big as you possibly can, to drive cost down internally. So a lot of internal functions, including IT, would have been referred to as cost centers. And therefore, the lower your costs, the better your profits can be. The larger your organization, the better pricing you can get from your suppliers. So cost was the competitive advantage, and this was really stopping new entrants that come into the market, because if you're a small organization, you're not able to negotiate the contracts with suppliers that the large organizations can, and therefore it's very difficult to compete. What we have seen in the last 10 years, though, with digital transformation, is that these advancements in technology and also the availability of knowledge has made the barrier to entry almost disappear. So it's now very easy for a small company with a handful of people to compete with much larger organizations on price. And one area in which their small companies have a special advantage is being able to deliver value to the customer much faster. The larger organizations, especially those that existed pre-2000, have a lot of legacy practices built on, guidance from the 1980s, and have very stable governance frameworks, which makes them very stable, make sure that they're very resilient, they can achieve their service levels, they have very little variance in quality. However, when it comes to change, it can take 6 months to 1 year to never for a customer request to be satisfied. So the modern business strategy emphasizes that the new competitive advantage is who can put value into the customer's hand first. With so much choice nowadays, customers will not wait for you. There is no loyalty, and even national boundaries don't safeguard you from competition, because digital services are available globally. Hence, the fast fish eats the slow fish. Now, if your business wants to be a fast fish, or due to intense competition within their market, they must become a fast fish, then the question comes, well, how do all of the internal functions become an enabler? So how can IT transform to be high velocity when the business needs to be high velocity in order to stay or become competitive? Well, this is where DevOps comes in. So DevOps as a coined noun of development and operations, and it's really a convergence of IT from the divergence of IT that happened in the early 2000s. So the divergence that happened within IT was one part of IT, which was development, started to emphasize the importance of speed in development. Operations, particularly with the IT service management guidance, was still designed around being low cost. So we had this divergence within IT. One half is looking at being as fast as possible, and the other half is looking at being as cheap as possible, which gives you conflicting goals. So the whole objective of DevOps is to converge IT back together with a common goal, which is how can we be a high velocity IT organization that acts as an enabler of high velocity business. And the key success factors for those that have been from IT service management circles will know about the people, process, technology, or we could say culture, practices, and automation, which would be the same thing. So how can we change the way that people think? How can we change the traditional low-cost practices to their high-velocity alternatives? And how can we use technology to our advantage to enable faster delivery of applications and other services as well? Traditional IT versus DevOps, I think for a lot of organizations, especially those pre-2000, would be, in this third column, very big batch sizes of work. So we bundle changes into releases. Those releases happen, maybe 4 times a year, maybe twice a year, with the objective of lowering cost and lowering risk. In a high velocity organization, we're much more focused on delivering value quickly. So we're looking at what are the micro or what are the small changes that still have value that we can put in the customer's hand very quickly. And the more quicker we are, the faster feedback we get. So an organization that delivers new value every quarter will only have 4 major interactions with their customers per year. A high velocity organization, which is releasing smaller changes, but still having a much more frequent interaction, for example, every month or even every 2 weeks, would be having 12 interactions per year or even 24 interactions per year with their customers. So that enables a much more dynamic customer relationship. The cultural aspect of do not fail is very common in pre-2000 companies. Do not fail manifests as extensive governance, very lengthy change control processes with change advisory boards and maybe multiple change advisory boards in some large companies. Where in a high velocity organization, it is expected that you're not going to be right every time. If you do 12 releases a year, one of those or more than one may not work, but because the change is small, the failure should also be small. So the risk is small, the cost is small, the change is small. So we are much happier with failure because we can recover much faster. And every time that we do fail, it's an opportunity to learn. So even if we failed, every release was a failure initially. If we're doing monthly releases, it means that we're failing and learning 12 times a year. So that cultural aspect of do not fail versus fail fast and fail forward is very different from a traditional IT to a high velocity IT organization. DevOps is also end-to-end. So the big challenge within IT was when part of IT went agile, that it's only one part of a life cycle. And it's very much like a relay race that you have your development teams who are developing new features. They're using Scrum or Kanban or any other, management technique that helps them to deliver features faster. However, they have to hand over the baton to another team that is not optimized for speed. The whole concept of DevOps and DevOps being about dev and ops working together means that we're really taking an end-to-end focus. So that means end-to-end means from the customer to the customer, regardless of who is in between. Other practices like continuous integration, delivery, and deployment are also human-centric practices. A lot of people might think that this is purely about buying Puppet and Jenkins and any number of automation tools. But all of these practices, all of these continuous practices are all about working together. So DevOps is very much an umbrella term, like Agile was an umbrella term that had Scrum and Kanban, extreme programming, DSTM, and others underneath it. DevOps is also an umbrella term that brings with it a lot of high velocity practices. So anyone who's practicing Agile fits very well within the culture of DevOps. One of the challenges, though, that we have with high velocity IT is that even though it's not completely new to the world, and especially, post 2000 organizations would be high velocity from the beginning because they have no legacy structures or IT systems to contend with. But there is no one single model. And this was very different to the service management world back in the ITIL version 3 days. In ITIL version 3 days, what was being pushed was standardization. The whole reason that standardization was being pushed was because it helps to lower the cost of IT. The downside of standardization is that it doesn't fit or is not contextualized for different scenarios. So those scenarios play out with terms such as multi-speed operating model, where a company that has a portfolio of many products and services, one way of operating may not make sense. So if IT provided, for example, 10 services, maybe a few of those might be optimized for low cost, like shared services, shared email, shared network. That makes sense. But other services, particularly digital services, are where we would optimize for high velocity because those digital services are profit generating. When you are profit generating, you are not a cost center. And so your operating model you can expect to be different. So that can bring in some challenges within IT itself that we're not necessarily looking for a one size fits all approach. We may be looking at the right design on a per product or a per service basis. It's also a transformation. A lot of IT organizations may still even be implementing to this day ITIL version 3, even though it was released in 2007. ITIL 4 has just been released last year in 2019 at the foundation level, and more content coming out in 2020. DevOps is also, looking at the same aspect of transformation. So transforming from an IT department that says we offer IT services, email service, network service, storage service, etc., to an IT department that is very closely linked to the business. And this is really the meaning behind digital, is that a digital organization identifies that IT is a fundamental part of the business. It's a strategic part of the business. So there is no distinction between the IT service and the business. They are one and the same. So whether we call it a business service or a digital service, this is the stage that we're at in 2020. Now, time for a short quiz. You can answer this mentally. True or false? So DevOps is a cultural movement. DevOps means dev doing ops. DevOps is one person's role. There is someone called Mr. or Mrs. DevOps. And DevOps does not need support from senior leadership. So I'll give you a moment to think about those questions, and I'll give you the answers on the next slide. Okay, so DevOps is a cultural movement. It started back in 2009 with two people, one Canadian and one Belgium, and then very quickly became a global movement. DevOps means dev doing ops. No, not at all. It's about working together. DevOps is a role. There are plenty of roles that are advertised on job sites for DevOps engineers, which may mislead people into thinking that DevOps is a role. But if you hire a DevOps engineer, then that's what you'll get. You will get a DevOps engineer. You won't get the culture of DevOps. And DevOps doesn't need senior management support or C-level support. It does, because the shift for IT, and it's a huge shift for IT to say we are no longer a low-cost center. We are now a high-velocity organization, can only happen if it underpins business strategy. So if business strategy is still talking about economies of scale and driving down cost, then IT must also leverage economies of scale and drive down cost. We're very specifically talking about DevOps being relevant for organizations that want to or have to become a fast fish. That's a strategic decision that's set at the top. When that decision is made, IT has the mandate to transform. Some market trends to be aware of individually is that organizations of all sizes are using DevOps or are thinking about, becoming more focused on high velocity. The biggest challenges, though, are the lack of skilled workforce. So it's just true of anything that is new to the world. That whenever a new thing comes out, there is a lack of people in the world who know about it. So that is the challenge that Global Knowledge and PeopleCert are aiming to address with their certification programs. So to address the lack of skilled workforce because of such demand out there in the market. And in terms of growth, there's a study that we reference there at the bottom, which is looking at a CAGR, that's compound annual growth rate of nearly 25% over the next 6 years. So that's quite a significant amount of growth, and being really driven by the digital transformation. The more organizations that become digital, the more high velocity business becomes relevant. The more high velocity business becomes relevant, the more high velocity IT is necessary. We can also look at the benefits. These are quantifiable benefits from studies. There's a State of DevOps report that's been published annually for at least the last 4 or 5 years. And we can see that high velocity organizations clearly have an advantage when it comes to speed. The downside may be that cost, we are not as cheap. IT is not as cheap. But remember, it's a different strategy. So when you see your strategy as low cost, then you look to lower costs where you can. When you look at speed as the competitive advantage, then all of the measurements related to faster become more relevant. How popular is DevOps by territory? Yeah, so if we look at the pie chart, we can see that it does seem to be more concentrated in North America and Europe. Most people in the world are not in North America or Europe, so it does seem skewed. However, I would point out that a lot of the market reports, or maybe even most of the market reports, are generated out of Europe and North America. So in terms of the respondents to those market research studies, then it would make sense that if it's a European-driven study, that there's a lot of European respondents, and same for North America. I can tell you within Singapore and Southeast Asia, there is huge demand for high velocity IT. In fact, one of Singapore's local banks, which was the small post office bank, so you can imagine, not a global leader by any means. So a small post office, heritage bank has been the best global bank 3 years running. And that is credited to a 10-year transformation of the entire business from traditional banking to what they now refer to as a 20,000 startup. So that is the culture that they have driven over the past 10 years. And as a result of that culture, has won Best Global Bank 3 years running, which is quite an achievement for such a small country. How popular is DevOps by organization size? Looking at the chart on the left, it's around, looking at companies greater than 250 employees would account for about 70% of the demand. Revenue-wise, it's quite an even spread. I think all organizations are looking for higher velocity today. In different industries, we can see the technology and financial services sectors. The first two boxes on the left there account for about 50%. This wouldn't be no surprise because essentially the financial services sector with the various fintech financial startups that have popped up all around the world. So that accounts for a lot of the transformation. Technology underpins that transformation, so it makes sense. I would expect that retail, telco, and education would be the up-and-coming sectors. Although 2020 being a very interesting year with the greatest driver for digital transformation being COVID-19, so I could possibly foresee that every industry, is looking at how they can transform to be more digital. Now, in terms of qualification, so looking at your own, investment in your education and your return on investment for that education. So in the certification landscape globally, the DevOps practices are under continuous evolution. That's because of how new they are to the world, but also because DevOps is not owned by anyone. So it's not like PMP, the famous project management certification that's owned by the Project Management Institute. There is no one who owns DevOps, just like there was no one who owned Agile. Because of this, there is no one universal body of knowledge. So no one can claim that, this is the standard way to do DevOps. And that's good because it does drive the continuous evolution. When someone owns something, you're always waiting for that owner to update the new version. And if they take their time, then you're sat there waiting. So the fact that no one owns DevOps is actually a good thing in terms of how quickly the practices are evolving. And there are different certifications out there in the market. There are 2 available at the moment from PeopleCert, with more planned. There is the DevOps Fundamentals, which is your foundation level course. And there is the DevOps Leadership, which is more targeted at those who are either going to lead a high velocity organization or have been tasked to lead a high velocity organization, or who are planning to lead a high velocity IT organization, including those that are utilizing or plan to utilize high velocity practices just within a particular team of an organization as well. The leadership does have a prerequisite of fundamentals. So if you are thinking about the leadership, you looked at the learning objectives and thought that's the one you want to do, then you would be expected to do the fundamentals to get the basics first as a prerequisite. For the fundamentals itself, it's going to focus on the basics, what everyone should know. I would expect that everyone within the IT organization who is going to be driving high velocity needs to know the fundamentals. It is not just for the agile crowd. It is not just for the service management crowd. It's not just for the service desk, for example. It is for everyone within that high velocity organization, and particularly those that have the mindset of traditional IT. So those that believe we still need standard processes, that we still need to standardize all of our infrastructure, that there is one operating model for IT. DevOps Fundamental is really going to bring about the consistent baseline knowledge and the mindset shift that is required to transition from traditional IT to high velocity IT. So the things that we'll cover, for example, would be very important things like the business value. What are the 3 ways, or which are the 3 rules or 3 basic principles, and agile project management, Scrum, and these 15 essential practices. So the 15 essential practices you can see in front of you now, quite different to what you would expect in a traditional IT service management course. You have number 12, for example, incident management, and number 11, release and deployment management. So 11 and 12, you would say, hey, those are in ITIL. There are, those are designed for being low cost. But what we're looking at in this particular course is their high velocity alternative. So for incident management, the traditional approach is escalation. So you log a ticket for level 1, then you go to level 2, then you go to level 3. That's all about lowering cost. The high velocity alternative is swarming. So how can we mobilize a team of people, the right team, to resolve that incident as quickly as possible? So speed is of the essence. Some other topics would be completely new to a lot of people in IT. For example, voice of the customer, which is really looking to understand value from the customer's perspective, value stream mapping, lean process optimization, which are coming in from lean heritage. Change control, very interesting. So we're looking at how we can manage change in a high velocity way versus the standardized change advisory boards. And number 15, anti-fragility, where we'd be talking about things like chaos engineering and how we can, deliberately break systems in a controlled way so that we become less fragile over time. Less fragile means more resilient. For the DevOps Leadership course, this is one step above the fundamentals. So fundamentals is the prerequisite, then moving into leader. So it's really looking at how do I build the team? How do I build the high velocity team? How do I give them high velocity goals that they can then self-organize around? How do I break down silos using cross-functional teams? How can we measure speed using techniques such as value stream mapping? So very different to a typical IT leadership course where we'd be again looking at standardization. This is different. This is really looking at how do we build and manage and sustain and nurture and measure high velocity organizations. How is PeopleCert DevOps different from other DevOps related courses in the market? One is on the the extent of PeopleCert in terms of the geography of where they operate, as well as the research that went into the development of the material. So over 100 sources of good practices, piloted with hundreds of candidates. These courses are running already. Very professional and comprehensive training material, so with slides and with explanations to dive deeper into what the instructor is explaining as they go through the courses. It also, because of PeopleCert's relationship with Axelos, who's the owner of ITIL, does help to bridge the gap between DevOps and traditional service management. And the final aspect is a strong focus on organizational change management. DevOps is fundamentally about people. It's about changing the culture, the way that IT works. So there'll be a lot of questions from IT. What does it mean to me? How do I transition, or how do I transform myself from one way of working to this new way of working? So a very, very, very strong focus on the people side of it through organizational change management. Global Knowledge and PeopleCert partnership working together. So PeopleCert is an examination institute and the IP owner of these courses, recognized in 200 countries around the world. So the PeopleCert certifications are, a good investment in terms of global awareness. Now, time for a final quiz. 3 questions. I'll let you read through, and then again, I'll give you. Okay, answer time. So DevOps has an official body of knowledge. No, there is no owner of DevOps, so no one can claim to have the official BOC. DevOps replaces ITIL or replaces IT service management. That is not true. DevOps is an umbrella term. So DevOps brings in any frameworks, any practices, any tools, any ways of working that share the same goal, which is high velocity IT. And ITIL 4 does have one book in its new library on high velocity IT practices as well. And the final question was how many practices within the PeopleCert DevOps Fundamentals? So it's 15 practices. So the fundamentals is not a history lesson. Some of the courses out there are, history of DevOps and, more focused on maybe some of the technical aspects as well, purely about continuous integration, continuous delivery from those automation tools. Whereas the PeopleCert DevOps Fundamentals contains 15 practices. So it's very comprehensive in terms of the content that you would pick up in either the 2-day or the 3-day version of that fundamentals course. Okay, now we're towards the end of the presentation. We have some time for some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. We'll, if you don't mind, folks, if you could put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll just take a few minutes to have Jamie answer those questions. So we'll take a few minutes, allow you to type your questions in that Q&A box, and I'll go ahead and read those for any questions that you do have. So one quick one, Jamie, that we received, and I'll answer that, are these slides available? We will be sending out a PDF of the slides along with a recording of this session, and that will be sent out a week from now. So look out for that. The other question, and Jamie, maybe you can help with this with your familiarity with PMI and PDUs. Are there PMI PDUs available for this presentation? If yes, what are the details to receive PDUs? I don't believe there are PDUs available for this session, but Jamie, maybe you could speak to that.
So PDUs for any I guess anything that's related to training can always be self-claimed. So PMI has two methods of managing its PDU system. One is that the provider arranges with PMI to validate a certain number of points, so those PDUs. Or if that's not done, for any training, for any webinars, any conferences that you attend, you're able to self-apply. And for a 1 hour webinar, then you can claim 1 hour. The only thing they don't allow you is to claim for breaks. So if you went for a training course and whatever that training is, if you feel that it's relevant to your role with the Project Management Institute, and it's a 9 to 5 training, and you've had your 15-minute tea break, your 1 hour lunch, and your 15-minute afternoon tea break, you can still claim 7 hours per day. It's just a manual claim that you do. So you don't actually need an official code to make that claim.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Another question came in here. What is Agile compared to DevOps? And then if you could do the same with Scrum compared to DevOps.
Yeah, sure. So Agile was the trend, in the early 2000s. So it was an umbrella term. No one owned it. And it was a term that became popular because there were various framework owners, Scrum being one of those frameworks. But there were other frameworks from the owners of extreme programming and DSDM and some others that all got together and said, you know what, we have a common purpose. And they agreed. There's some fireside dinner that they had, I think, in 2001. And as a result of that fireside dinner, they wrote the Agile Manifesto, which is what you can see on the agilemanifesto.org. So it was a cultural movement from frameworks that had been developed separately, but they realized that, you know what, we share a common goal, and that's about delivering software faster or developing software faster. So what is Agile compared to DevOps? Agile was a movement in the software development community that started in 2001. A very important transformation within IT, but it caused a divergence. It caused IT to split. It caused dev and ops to move on separate paths. So DevOps is the convergence that happened 10 years later, where development and ops said, we should really share common goals, because there's no point development being very, very fast in developing a new feature if every time we hand over to operations for implementation, you tell me I have to fill in standard change and go through the change advisory board, and only 3 months after I've developed the feature does it get implemented. So Agile was a divergence of IT, but a very important divergence, and DevOps is a convergence. So DevOps includes the Agile practices underneath the Agile frameworks like Scrum and Kanban, etc., because they enable high velocity IT. What is Scrum compared to DevOps? Again, DevOps is an umbrella term. Scrum is a practice, so it's a high velocity practice. So Scrum fits under that umbrella term of DevOps.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Another question here: can a DevOps framework work with purchased, configured applications where there's no development involved?
Well, DevOps is not a framework, so it's more about how we all work together under a common goal. Now, let me give you an example of a common goal. Let's say we have a digital product, and that digital product, with our customer, we've agreed that we're going to do new feature releases every 2 weeks. So that is our high velocity goal, new features every 2 weeks. So when that is our high velocity goal, it doesn't matter where you are within that life cycle, developing the product, building it, testing it, deploying it, running it, you all share that same goal. So if you're purchasing configured applications, you can still have high velocity goals on other things other than development. So you could still have high velocity goals for support or high velocity goals for requests. But a high velocity goal for development would be difficult because you don't own that application. So unless you have a very strategic relationship with that application company, you would be limited by how quick you can be because you're buying an off-the-shelf solution. If they decide they're only going to release four releases a year every quarter, that's as fast as you can be. You would have to then think about, is this relationship that you have with that purchase software causing you a competitive disadvantage or not? It's also, it's also the reason why a lot of companies are insourcing software development now, because IT is being seen as a competitive advantage and you don't outsource your competitive advantage.
That makes sense. Thanks, Jamie. And just for all the participants, I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. Just that several questions came in regarding next step in becoming certified, what courses are available. That's all something that we as Global Knowledge offer and want you to be able to definitely make use of that. And in fact, we'll talk here at the end of how we can make that really easy for you to make that transition into taking some courses. Jamie, another question: how do you use DevOps when starting a new software implementation project that includes BPR and strict compliance rules? I'm not sure if BPR makes sense to you, Jamie, but how do you use DevOps when starting that?
It's a common question. So we've been in business a long time. We're in a regulated industry, and we're used to working with regulators who expect to see how we're compliant to the law, right, to the regulation. And the good thing about regulation is it's industry-wide. So if company A, B, and C all have to comply with the same regulation, then neither is at a competitive disadvantage. However, one of the things we saw in Singapore, and it would have happened the same in the USA and Europe as well, is when, for example, the ride-hailing taxi companies like Uber, which you would know in North America would be very popular. In Southeast Asia, our equivalent is called Grab. When Uber came to Singapore and then left Singapore, but when Uber came to Singapore, the incumbent taxi companies complained to the regulator. They said it's not fair that these virtual taxi companies are able to operate because they don't have to comply with the same regulations that we do. And the regulator turned around to them and said, well, that's complete nonsense. Regulation is regulation. Everyone has to comply. The difference is Uber is complying through their technology, and you, incumbent company, are complying through manual process. So there's no point crying about the regulation. What you're really upset about is your implementation of how you comply. So that is where the disadvantage comes in. So this is where a lot of traditional companies are falling over, because they have a lot of manual processes and they say, I need this for compliance. However, there may be a newer digital alternative which your competitors are using. The regulator will not tell you what your competitors are doing because that would be unfair to the market. So for some of the, the taxi companies and the banks and, these companies that have been around 20, 30 years, they're having to rethink how they comply with the regulation other than using manual processes.
Perfect. Maybe one more question here, Jamie. Unless there are others, feel free to put those in the chat. But the last question that I see here, what is the next step in becoming educated or certified in DevOps after this class, and you can speak to it, and then that kind of leads into just the last slide that I'll have as well.
Yeah, it does. So, I mean, the purpose of this session was to introduce you to why DevOps is so important. You know, it is important because as businesses transform their business models to be high velocity, IT must transform its operating model to be high velocity. How do we do that? With DevOps. And then the offering through Global Knowledge and PeopleCert is the certification training in DevOps, which Luke can talk about, you know, how you access that training, I guess now.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. If you want to advance the slide there
Yeah.
next, we do want to make it easy for all the attendees today. In fact, so we're running these questions or these courses that Jamie mentioned earlier in his presentation, the DevOps Fundamentals course and the PeopleCert DevOps Leadership courses. We're running those frequently, and as you can imagine, they are becoming more and more popular as the months go by. And so I put a couple of links into the chat. I would encourage each of you to go into the chat, click on those. That's going to take you to all of our DevOps courses that Global Knowledge has, including these fundamentals and leadership courses that are just outstanding content for you to look at. Along with that, we're going to, for everyone that attended today, give you 25% off of those courses, each of those just for attending today's session. So when you would go to checkout after enrolling for one of those courses, you would just use one of these course codes and you'll get this in the deck as well, webinar 25, and that will automatically give you 25% off each of these courses for you to continue this DevOps journey. So finally, just be sure to click those links, visit Global Knowledge. We have a number of ways you can visit us or ask questions of us. You can go to our website, access just a ton of additional free resources for you to look at, technical articles, white papers, etc., and even upcoming webinars such as this that you can go ahead and sign up for. So Jamie, Sarah, again, thank you for joining us today. Really helpful content. And again, folks, you will hear this great presentation from Jamie as long as your company hasn't opted out of receiving emails, which we always hear from about 5% that didn't get the content because legally, when a company opts out, obviously we can't send that. But if that's the case, feel free to reach out to Global Knowledge and we can make sure to get that to you in another way. So Jamie, thanks again. Time to go get some sleep. And Sarah, thank you for being here. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.